Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel where history meets the pillow and the past becomes your pathway to peaceful slumber. Tonight, we're diving into something that sounds like it should be exciting, but I promise you, by the end of this, you'll be drifting off to the most wonderfully mundane tales of royal childbirth that history has to offer. Now, before we begin our journey through the most peculiar yet utterly sleep inducing royal births in recorded history, take a moment to like this video if you're ready to learn something fascinating while simultaneously preparing your brain for rest. And if you're new here, subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to the gentle rhythm of historical storytelling. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and whether you're already in bed or getting ready to be. It's always wonderful to see our global community of history lovers and sleep seekers. Now dim those lights, maybe adjust your pillow, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of the strangest circumstances surrounding royal arrivals throughout the ages. You might think that being born into royalty would be straightforward. After all, these are the most documented, most anticipated, most carefully planned births in human history. Surely the arrival of future kings and queens would be routine, predictable, almost boring in their precision. Well, you'd be absolutely right about the boring part, but for entirely different reasons than you might expect. Throughout history, royal births have been surrounded by the most elaborate, tedious, and frankly absurd protocols imaginable. We're talking about ceremonies so detailed, so meticulously planned, and so utterly mind-numbing that they could put an insomniac to sleep faster than counting sheep. And tonight, we're going to explore these peculiar circumstances with all the excitement of watching paint dry on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Let me set the scene for what we're about to discover together. We'll be examining births that took place in the most unusual locations, under the strangest circumstances, and with the most ridiculous protocols that medieval and early modern Europe could devise. But here's what makes this perfect for sleep. These aren't action-packed adventures. These are slow, methodical, wonderfully repetitive stories about waiting, ceremony, and the kind of bureaucratic procedures that would make watching grass grow seem thrilling. What we're really exploring tonight are the moments when royal protocol met unexpected reality, creating situations so bizarre yet so thoroughly documented that they've become historical footnotes, perfect for gentle contemplation. These aren't tales of drama or excitement. They're stories of confusion, mild inconvenience, and the sort of administrative complications that make excellent bedtime material. Our first peculiar birth takes us to the year 1165, to a drafty castle in Normandy, where the future Henry the Young King was born during what can only be described as the most methodically planned yet utterly chaotic royal delivery in recorded history. Now, when I say chaotic, I don't mean exciting chaos. I mean the kind of slow motion, administrative confusion that happens when too many people with too many titles try to organize something that nature has already figured out quite well on its own. The peculiarity of this birth wasn't in its location or timing, but in the sheer number of witnesses required by Norman protocol. You see, royal births needed to be verified by an almost comically large number of official observers. We're talking about bishops, nobles, scribes, and various court officials all crowding into a chamber, each with their own specific role in documenting the event. The process was so thoroughly bureaucratic that it resembled less a birth and more a very slow, very formal committee meeting about a birth. The preparations began weeks in advance, with detailed schedules drawn up for who would stand where, when they would arrive, and what they would witness. Lists were made of lists. Protocols were written for following protocols. It was the kind of administrative thoroughness that would make modern bureaucracy seem spontaneous and carefree by comparison. On the day itself, the process unfolded with all the excitement of a medieval tax audit. Officials arrived at precisely scheduled intervals, took their designated positions, and waited and waited and waited. Because, as it turns out, babies don't particularly care about administrative schedules, even royal ones. The birth chamber was arranged with the precision of a military operation, albeit one conducted entirely by people whose primary qualification was their ability to stand still for long periods while looking appropriately solemn. Chairs were positioned at exact angles. Candles were lit in specific sequences. Even the arrangement of the medical supplies followed a detailed protocol that had been debated and revised multiple times by committees of nobles who had never attended a birth in their lives. What made this particular birth especially strange was the weather. A winter storm had descended on the castle, making travel difficult and causing several key witnesses to arrive late. This created what medieval chroniclers described as a most vexing administrative complication, which is perhaps the most wonderfully boring way to describe the mild inconvenience of having to reschedule official observers for a royal birth. The delay meant that additional protocols had to be improvised, creating even more paperwork and requiring even more officials to verify that the improvised protocols were being followed correctly. It was bureaucracy breeding bureaucracy, creating a wonderfully tedious spiral of administrative redundancy that would have made the birth of a future king feel like the processing of a particularly complicated tax form. Meanwhile, the actual medical aspects of the birth were handled by a small group of experienced midwives who worked quietly and efficiently while surrounded by this circus of official witnesses. They had seen dozens of births, royal and otherwise, and approached their work with the calm professionalism of people who understood that babies arrive when they're ready, regardless of how many nobles are standing around with quill pens. The contrast between the midwife's practical efficiency and the elaborate ceremonial requirements created a uniquely medieval kind of absurdity. Here were medical professionals trying to do their job while navigating around bishops holding ceremonial candles, scribes trying to document everything in real time, and nobles arguing quietly about whether they were standing in the correct order according to precedents. The birth itself, when it finally occurred, was anticlimactic in the most perfectly boring way possible. The baby arrived healthy. The required witnesses confirmed that yes, this was indeed a baby, and yes, it appeared to be male, and the extensive documentation process began immediately. Forms were filled out in triplicate. Seals were applied to documents. Official announcements were prepared according to templates that had been used for generations. What followed was perhaps even more tedious than the birth itself, the verification process. Each witness had to provide sworn testimony about what they had observed, following specific legal formulas that had been established by precedent. These testimonies were then copied by scribes, reviewed by legal officials, and filed in multiple archives according to a classification system that was so complex it required its own manual. The entire process, from the first labor pains to the final filing of the last document, took nearly 3 days. 3 days of the most methodical, thoroughly documented, and utterly sleep inducing administrative activity that medieval Europe could produce. It was efficiency and bureaucracy combining to create something so perfectly mundane that it became almost beautiful in its tedium. And this was just the beginning, because once word of the birth spread, additional protocols kicked in. Messengers had to be dispatched to various nobles and foreign courts, following specific routes and carrying letters written according to established diplomatic formulas. Each message had to be approved by different officials, copied for records, and sent with appropriate ceremony. The announcements themselves were exercises in medieval bureaucratic poetry, full of elaborate titles, formal language, and the kind of respectful repetition that makes excellent material for falling asleep. They weren't exciting proclamations of joy. They were carefully worded administrative notifications that managed to make the birth of a future king sound like the quarterly report of a particularly well-managed monastery. The ceremonial aspects continued for weeks after the actual birth, creating a cascade of additional protocols that would make watching drying ink seem thrilling by comparison. Court officials had to organize a series of formal presentations, each following procedures so detailed they required their own instruction manuals. These weren't celebrations in any modern sense, but rather methodical displays of administrative competence that unfolded with all the spontaneity of a carefully rehearsed funeral. The baby himself, future Henry the Young King, was blissfully unaware of the bureaucratic machinery churning around his arrival. He did what babies do: sleep, eat, and occasionally cry, while dozens of officials debated the proper protocol for announcing his first sneeze. Yes, there were actually discussions about whether certain bodily functions required documentation. The answer, predictably, was yes. Moving forward through our wonderfully tedious journey, we encounter the birth of Philip Augustus of France in 1165, which occurred under circumstances so methodically strange that they've become the stuff of administrative legend. This wasn't strange because of danger or drama, but because it represented the absolute pinnacle of bureaucratic birth management that medieval France could achieve. The peculiarity began months before the actual birth, when court officials realized that the existing protocols for royal births were insufficiently detailed for their liking. Not content with merely following established procedures, they decided to create new ones. Committees were formed to discuss the formation of other committees. Subcommittees were established to review the work of the main committees. It was a beautifully circular process of administrative self-perpetuation that would have made modern corporate management seem streamlined. The birth chamber was prepared according to specifications so precise they included measurements for the exact distance between candles, the proper angle for positioning prayer books, and detailed instructions for the appropriate facial expressions that witnesses should maintain during different phases of the proceedings. These instructions were written down, reviewed, revised, and then written down again, creating what was essentially a medieval manual for looking appropriately solemn while standing still. What made this birth particularly noteworthy in the annals of royal peculiarity was the weather documentation requirement. Court officials had decided that the meteorological conditions at the moment of birth needed to be recorded for posterity. This meant that throughout the labor, scribes were stationed at windows, carefully noting cloud formations, wind direction, and the precise quality of daylight. They created what may have been history's first documented example of birth-related weather reporting. The actual moment of birth was preceded by what chronicles describe as the Great Waiting Period, during which assembled witnesses stood in their assigned positions for nearly 6 hours. 6 hours of standing perfectly still while maintaining appropriate expressions of anticipation. No fidgeting was permitted. No casual conversation was allowed. It was like the world's most boring meditation retreat, except with more ceremonial robes and significantly more administrative oversight. The medical aspects of the birth were handled by a team of midwives who worked with admirable efficiency despite being surrounded by what was essentially a very formal, very quiet audience. These women had to navigate not only the normal challenges of childbirth, but also the additional complexity of working while dozens of people watched their every move and took notes. It was performance art of the most mundane variety. When the baby finally arrived, the response was not cheers or celebration, but rather the immediate implementation of verification protocols. Each witness had to confirm, in order of precedence, that they had observed the birth of what appeared to be a male child. This confirmation process followed a script so detailed that it specified not only what words to use, but also the tone of voice in which they should be spoken. The result was a chorus of nobles reciting the medieval equivalent of administrative small talk. The documentation process that followed was a masterpiece of bureaucratic redundancy. Multiple scribes recorded the same information in different formats, using different types of ink on different types of parchment, all according to regulations that had been established by previous committees and approved by subsequent committees. It was like watching the world's most methodical game of medieval telephone, except instead of the message changing, it was copied exactly the same way dozens of times. The birth announcement itself was a work of administrative art, crafted according to diplomatic protocols that had been refined over generations. It managed to convey the essential information about the birth while using so many formal titles, respectful phrases, and ceremonial language that the actual news was buried under layers of bureaucratic politeness. Reading it aloud would have been an excellent cure for insomnia, which was probably not the intended effect, but certainly was the achieved one. Following the announcement came the gift-receiving protocols, which were somehow even more tedious than the birth itself. Each gift had to be officially received according to specific procedures, cataloged according to established systems, and acknowledged with responses that followed diplomatic templates. The process of receiving a single ceremonial spoon could take an entire morning, involving multiple officials and generating paperwork that would outlast the spoon itself. The baby's first public appearance was scheduled according to astrological calculations that had been verified by court astronomers and approved by religious authorities. This meant more committees, more documentation, and more standing around while officials debated whether the planetary alignment was sufficiently favorable for a royal infant to be glimpsed by carefully selected members of the nobility. Our next peculiar birth takes us to England in 1207, where the future Henry III was born under circumstances that would have been completely ordinary if not for the extraordinary administrative response they generated. This wasn't a birth complicated by external events, but rather a birth that became complicated purely through the application of excessive organizational enthusiasm. The peculiarity began when court officials realized that no one had ever created a comprehensive manual for royal birth procedures. Rather than simply following tradition, they decided to document everything, creating what amounted to a real-time instruction guide for future royal births. This meant that every action, no matter how routine, had to be discussed, approved, and recorded before it could be implemented. The result was a birth that proceeded at the pace of a particularly thorough legal proceeding, with frequent pauses for consultation, documentation, and the kind of careful deliberation that would make judicial proceedings seem hasty by comparison. It was efficiency through extreme inefficiency, creating a perfectly boring spectacle of administrative conscientiousness. The birth chamber was arranged with the methodical precision of a monastery library, with officials consulting their newly created manual at every step. Each candle placement required approval from 3 different authorities. The positioning of ceremonial items followed diagrams that had been drawn and redrawn multiple times by committees who seemed to genuinely enjoy the process of creating more diagrams. What made this birth particularly sleep-inducing was the real-time documentation requirement. Scribes were positioned throughout the chamber, each responsible for recording different aspects of the proceedings. One scribe documented the timing of events, another recorded the weather conditions, and a third was tasked with noting the facial expressions of key witnesses. The result was a birth that was simultaneously thoroughly documented and utterly devoid of spontaneity. The medical team worked with admirable patience as officials frequently paused the proceedings to consult their manual and ensure that everything was being done according to the newly established protocols. It was like watching a medieval version of following assembly instructions, except the thing being assembled was a royal birth ceremony, and the instructions were being written simultaneously by people who had never assembled anything before. The actual moment of birth was followed by what chronicles describe as the Great Verification Ceremony, a process so methodical that it made the earlier proceedings seem spontaneous. Each witness had to confirm their observations according to a checklist that ran to several pages, covering everything from the baby's apparent health to the precise time of day as measured by multiple sundials that had been positioned specifically for this purpose. The announcement protocols that followed were equally thorough, involving a cascade of messengers who departed at carefully calculated intervals to ensure that news of the birth reached different destinations in the proper order of precedence. The messages themselves were crafted according to templates that specified not only what information to include, but also the appropriate level of enthusiasm to express for recipients of different ranks. Our journey through these peculiar births concludes with perhaps the most wonderfully mundane example of all, the birth of Louis Napoleon of France in 1214, which achieved historical notoriety not through drama or danger, but through the sheer administrative perfectionism that surrounded it. This was a birth that became strange purely through the application of excessive organizational competence. The preparations began nearly a year in advance, with officials creating detailed schedules for every aspect of the birth process. These schedules were then reviewed by committees, revised by subcommittees, and approved by oversight committees in a process that generated more paperwork than most modern corporations produce in a fiscal quarter. It was bureaucracy achieving a kind of artistic perfection through pure dedication to administrative detail. The birth itself unfolded with the precision of a carefully choreographed dance, except performed by people standing very still and speaking in whispers. Every participant knew exactly where to stand, when to speak, and how to maintain the appropriate expression of respectful attention for extended periods. It was like watching a very slow, very formal meditation session conducted by people wearing ceremonial robes. The documentation process that followed created what may have been the most thoroughly recorded birth in medieval history. Multiple scribes working in shifts produced thousands of pages of records, covering everything from the baby's first cry to the precise arrangement of furniture in the birth chamber. These records were then copied, reviewed, and filed according to a classification system that was so complex it required its own index. The ceremonial aspects continued for months after the actual birth, creating a series of increasingly elaborate protocols that seemed designed primarily to generate more protocols. Court officials organized formal presentations, ceremonial gift exchanges, and diplomatic receptions that followed procedures so detailed they could have served as instruction manuals for other courts seeking to achieve similar levels of administrative excellence. And so we conclude our journey through these wonderfully tedious tales of royal births, each one stranger than the last, not through excitement or drama, but through the magnificent mundanity of medieval administrative perfection. These weren't births marked by adventure or danger, but by the kind of methodical thoroughness that could transform the most natural event in human experience into a bureaucratic masterpiece. These stories remind us that even the most significant moments in history often unfolded with all the excitement of a particularly well-organized filing system. The future kings and queens of Europe entered the world not through dramatic circumstances, but through the steady application of administrative procedures that were so perfectly boring they achieved a kind of meditative quality. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of medieval scribes carefully documenting the weather conditions at the moment of birth, or of nobles standing in perfectly arranged formations while maintaining appropriately solemn expressions for hours at a time. These are the kinds of wonderfully mundane details that make history the perfect companion for peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams, and remember that sometimes the strangest things in history are also the most perfectly, beautifully, and sleep-inducingly ordinary. Until next time, may your rest be as peaceful as a medieval birth chamber filled with quietly efficient bureaucrats doing their jobs with methodical precision.